Dark Horse presents Diabolu, Frank and Paul Hicks on Endgame. Terminator now!
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
Was there anything special for you about the Terminator, or was it just another one of those iconic 80s franchises that everybody likes?
Well, I've always been a science fiction kid, so things that were sci-fi always sort of got bumped up the queue for me, but Terminator sort of brushed up against the horror side, which was a bit scary, and for some reason I didn't go see it in 84, probably because I was just a wuss. But I did catch it before I saw Terminator 2. And then I've seen every single Terminator film, for better or worse, just because I can't help myself. I sort of like to be completist like that.
I don't remember if I asked you before. You did not read any of the Now stuff.
No, I was interested in the Now stuff, but it was just hard to find on the shelves, and I wasn't someone who could afford to buy a back issue if it was overpriced or, jacked up like they were at the time. So I never got one. Yeah. But I came to Terminator comics because James Robinson was writing them, and by that stage of his career, he was someone I was actively following and looking out for. I just picked up everything that he wrote and kind of didn't partake of any of the rest of it. Though I had read The Burning Earth at some point and then sold it at some point. So I remember thinking that looked pretty, but not thinking much of it.
You bought the one-shot new, right?
Yes.
Did James Robinson have a career in the UK before the US? I thought he started over here.
He was kind of niche. I first became aware of him when he was writing Firearm for Malibu, so that's kind of when he first hit my radar. And I don't know if I bought One Shot New. I might have bought it within 6 months of it coming out.
His output here in the States was pretty minor before he had worked with Dark Horse. I think he had done a graphic novel for Epic, and then I think he started doing the Terminator stuff, and then I think that on the strength of that is how he got Firearm. So that's why the timeline was messing up with my head.
Yeah, I think what actually happened with Robinson is he had quite a reputation with editors because they had read some of the stuff that hadn't come out yet and they knew about it. Like Archie Goodwin basically spruiked Starman to me at a Sydney Comic Con way back, it would have been the 80s, and basically said, this is coming out, and I looked at it and said, I'm not really into occult stuff. And he said, no, it's not like that. He's writing The Golden Age, which is about to come out. It's really good. Yeah, so he basically was, I think everyone who knew in editorial circles, James Robinson was a talent that people had spotted earlier. So he had a lot of unpublished stuff that was getting him some good jobs because of that.
And I think to some degree, a lot of people look at James Robinson from the viewpoint of pre and post Hollywood, which people do, Howard Chaykin, Frank Miller, a lot of those people can be looked at that. I think to some degree what you look at is pre and post Archie Goodwin. Or post Archie Goodwin, because he would have been familiar with him through the Epic Comics work. When he went over from Marvel to DC, he brought Robinson with him and got him on the Legends of the Dark Knight art, Blades, if I remember correctly. And then, of course, when Zero Hour came around, and it was with Archie that he did one of the spin-off books. So I think that maybe his biggest cheerleader and maybe one of his great influences on the quality of his work may have been Archie Goodwin.
Yeah, I would say that's probably a fair call. And, I mean, the stuff that he had before, it wasn't like financially successful or popular or sold, it wasn't well known at all, but people who read it went, this guy's got talent. And I would count, like, London's Dark, I think, is one of his earliest graphic novels. It's really cool. Like, it's a really good book. It's one of my favorite books of his. And 67 Seconds was kind of like a take on a Lois Clark. It's a thriller if they were just reporters. That was the epic one. That was the one that sort of didn't really succeed. But I mean, it was overpriced. So to buy it was like $20 back in the late 80s. So, yeah.
Well, and that's the one that I, for whatever reason, I glommed onto that one. I never read it, but I don't know if it was in Marvel Age or Comic Shop News or something, but somebody was talking up that one particular graphic novel, and that was the first time I remember hearing his name, and then it started popping up more and more pretty quickly after that.
Yeah, I did a bit of connecting the dots once Firearm started coming out, because, he wrote this thing in, Legends of the Dark Knight that I like. He just became someone I automatically followed until that became kind of embarrassing at some point.
Oh, Hollywood?
Yeah, I mean, like, there is a point in his career where he just seems, like, lost, and I don't know if he's inebriated or coked out, but, there's nothing it's all sort of, none of the passion is there at some point in his career.
Did you read the Image Comics Airboy miniseries that he did?
Oh, yeah.
So I think all of the above sounds about right.
Yeah. And I actually met him before that came out. This was when Twitter wasn't so hazardous for people, but I got on Twitter basically because he was on Twitter. That was my prime motivation. And I basically introduced myself and said, hey, I wrote to you pretty much for every single comic you've written. You know, I've had letters published in lots of your books. I'm coming to America and I'm going to be in San Francisco because I believe that's where you live. Is it possible for us to, meet? And he actually met me at Isotope Comics just on his own. He brought his dog over and we spent about an hour hanging out, and he signed some stuff for me, took some photos with me. And that was when he was talking about everything that went wrong with Earth 2 at that stage, and how it was sort of pitched to him as a classic Justice Society in the 40s. And that's when Nicholas Scott came on board, and then it got deditoed into this alternate reality thing. But he was conscious of the fact that Nicola was much more inclined to make the best of that than he was. So
yeah, and knowing that you're writing for her, I figured that's probably why he hung on as long as he did.
Yeah. But I mean, he told me about the Airboy series that he was writing, and he was sort of saying about, he was writing this thing about what a mess his life had become and look out for it. And so that made a lot of sense when I read that.
And that was one of the last things I remember reading of his that I actually really enjoyed too. And I think he's got an incredible catalog of work. A lot fewer high points in the latter part of the career.
Yeah, well, pretty much up to the midpoint of Starman, everything he'd written was worth a look. And that goes back to, a very short run on Wildcats Team 1 miniseries. What else was there? He did some Vampirella stuff. He did some really, really indie stuff in A1 and Crisis, the British Crisis, not the American one. So he was all over the place. Like, I think he was taking any gig that sounded interesting, and at the start of his career, everything was interesting because of where he was at, the sheer talent he was applying.
Solicitation copy from Dark Horse Insider number 9, cover dated September 1992. Solicitation copy reads, The Terminator Endgame number 1 of 3. This is the big one, the last of Dark Horse's Terminator series. And what a way to go. In this final 3-issue series, Skynet sends a big, brawling mother of a Terminator from the future to change the past. His goal, to prevent the birth of John Connor, even as Sarah goes into labor. The Rebel Alliance is reduced to Colonel Mary Randall, the one woman who might save the future, but at what cost to the present. Written by James Robinson, this series ties up all the loose ends from previous Terminator storylines while bringing us a slam-bang finish. Pencil art by Jackson Guice, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and inker John Beatty joined forces to create powerful interior art. British artist John Higgins, The Thing from Another World, supplies the cover painting. $2.50 US, $3 Canada, 32 color pages, painted cover, monthly, shipping September 1st, 1992. Mike's Amazing World of Comics agreed with that date, echoed in Previews Volume 2, Number 7, a house ad in Dark Horse Presents Number 66, at the registration at the Library of Congress, and surprisingly is just a few days off from the Capital City Usenet date, and Comic Shop News Number 271. Excerpt from the inside front cover of Endgame numbers 1 through 2. What came before. Sarah Connor went into hiding following the first failed mission of a Terminator sent from the future. She was carrying the child she and Kyle Reese had conceived before he died fighting the Terminator. Shortly afterward, more future soldiers, including Colonel Mary Randall, arrived in the present, planning to kill Dr. Hollister, the man who had developed Skynet from the salvaged remains of that first Terminator time traveler. A team of Terminators, including Dudley, the half-human, half-Terminator, I-825.M, followed the soldiers through time with their primary objective to protect Hollister. During the ensuing battle, the human half of I-825.M's brain overrode his Terminator programming, and he joined forces with the human soldiers. The two forces reached a stalemate, and the surviving Terminator, C-890.L, switched to its secondary objective, find and kill Sarah Connor. Mary and Dudley, joined by Dr. Ed Aston, failed to find any trace of Sarah Connor in Mexico. Meanwhile, Dudley became ever more tormented with the struggle to keep his Terminator half suppressed. He asked Dr. Aston to operate on him in order to remove his Terminator programming, but Aston found the Terminator's psychological data that was stored in Dudley's brain and downloaded it onto disk. Then began a brain wipe of Dudley before escaping. Mary discovered Dudley just in time and saved him before his human half was completely purged as well. In a dramatic confrontation at Cyberdyne Systems, C-890.L, Hollister, and Aston all perished, and Mary and Dudley, joined by Lieutenant Sloan, thought they'd finally been successful in changing the future. But now, Dudley has disappeared, and the FBI has the Terminator remains, as well as the data that Aston extracted from Dudley's brain, and surely someone will figure out how to put all that information to good use. Lieutenant Sloan has disavowed any further connection with Colonel Mary Randall, having murdered an FBI agent who planned to sell off certain Terminator remains to the highest bidder. Unfortunately, a new Terminator has appeared in the Canadian tundra, ready for action. While Sarah Connor is soon to give birth to the child slated to be humankind's savior, a brutal killer by the name of Catfish is at large, with Sloan hot on his trail. Meanwhile, Mary Randall has finally made contact with the long-lost Dudley, the half-human, half-Terminator, but he seems to be decidedly more Terminator than human.
Lockhurst, the white-haired dude Sloan knew from the FBI Academy, had kept his superiors in the dark so that he could pump his police detective former classmate for more information to sell on the black market. However, Lieutenant Sloan pumped Lockhurst full of lead instead. Sloan knew it needed to be done, but was haunted by the murder, and that's why he wanted nothing further to do with Mary. Evidence was destroyed, Sloan went on with his life, and months later pursued the Terminator copycat killer dubbed Catfish. Meanwhile, Mary scraped by in the past by gardening for minimum wage. Mary had also become estranged from Dudley, who had disappeared. John Connor was set to be born on October 4th, grounding every Dark Horse miniseries except Hunters and Killers in 1984, despite Tempest having asserted that it was set in 1990. The day before the birth, Mary tracked Dudley to San Diego, only to discover his mind had been taken over completely by his rebooted cyborg brain.
Finally, we're on to Endgame. Again, this is an interesting circumstance because these stories were begun before there was a Terminator sequel, and now they're trying to deal with the consequences of it afterwards. I very much had to deal with this with my Aliens podcast because you had the Mark Verheiden stories that were done leading into Alien 3, and of course Alien 3 kind of breaks the franchise, breaks all the continuity. You know, there's no recovering the continuity to the point where having to rename characters from the movie as though they're brand new characters just to try to white out over their own continuity and still make it be viable. I don't think that this miniseries was as adversely affected by T2, but at the same time, T2 has a definitive ending. And as you've talked about in the past, with the sequels, the struggle is why do these things exist? Because it's so clearly wrapped up in the second movie that there's really no place to go unless you invalidate the second movie. And since that's the movie that I think the majority of the people love the best, they get really upset when you do that.
Yeah. I do like the end twist of this series, which is something we should probably get to towards the end of the discussion.
But you saw Terminator 2. How did you respond to that movie when you first saw it?
I loved it. Like, it was probably the best action film I'd ever seen in my life at that stage. I thought in amongst all that action is some very valid points about what a good dad is and things like that. The protective side versus the fact that John Connor has had foster parents who don't treat him well, abuse him and things like that. And he got this robot with no feelings that is just there to protect him. And that is it's a heady dimension to the story that makes it not just an action film, you know?
And it's interesting too, because she is trying to live up to this legacy that she expects of herself and of her son to defend humanity. And in doing so becomes so hard and so inhuman that an actual robot is able to have more warmth for their own son than she's capable of.
Yeah. And the fact that the mission becomes everything for her and there's no capacity for love and nurturing in the mission. Whereas, you know, you think that would be the most important thing about raising the savior of humanity.
Right. And we've got another Starman connection too, because these covers are by Tony Harris, at least the first one. And I do believe this, you know, Starman's still a couple years away at this point. So I'm wondering if the connection between this artist and this writer began here or not.
Yeah, I don't know. I believe Archie put Tony and James together. So, I mean, Archie must have had samples of Tony's stuff at some point.
And I do like, too, that there was a tendency towards the bizlification of these covers. Like, everybody just wanted to show a cool cyborg with metal parts sticking out and stuff. And I like that while Harris does that for the first issue, as expected, he's doing it in a different way. For starters, this is a mostly nude form, including no hair. And there's definitely things that show that there's a cyborg, particularly a bit of skin off of one of the arms and the red targeting laser coming out of his eye, but it's done in a somewhat, I don't know, it's more impressionistic, or it's stylized in a way that's very different from what someone like a Bisley would be doing, or what the like heavy metal covers, like rock album covers we're looking at. I appreciate that he's coming at it from a different place than so many of the other cover artists that had worked on this Terminator stuff.
Hang on, we're going to have to correct, because I think it is John Higgins who's the artist on the covers, not Tony Harris.
Is it? Oh, it's Higgins. Oh, well, I'm way off then.
I was going, I don't recall this being Tony Harris. I was looking while you were talking.
Well, and looking at the first cover, I can see where I would come to that conclusion, but then I look at the second and third, it's like, oh yeah, that's not Tony Harris. What the hell am I talking about? What a fool believes. Yeah, my bad. Yeah, John Higgins, it's credited right there on the inside front cover. I screwed up.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I appreciated that he had a different take. Kudos to John Higgins going there with like a bad ad lib. Oh, look at these great covers with John Higgins. Remember when John Higgins worked on Starman? No, I don't remember that because that didn't happen.
I'm pretty sure James did work with him on Legends of the Dark Knight, but I don't think it was when either of them were new. It was much further into their careers.
So opening this book up, like you say you've got the quasi-trade, but when you say the inside front covers, that's an awful lot of text on that side front cover for what came before, isn't it?
It is. And
do you feel like
it's hard
that
to read.
gives you what you need going into this comic book, or do you still feel a little bit lost?
No, I felt less lost in this one than I did with Secondary Objectives, just because I knew who the characters were, and the mission is still roughly the same. It's just a little bit further along. So, yeah, I wasn't struggling.
So this opening sequence with the Lockhurst character from the FBI, he is in Secondary Objectives. So did you recognize him from that?
Yeah, I assumed he was the guy who survived the big cop gunfight.
And so were you happy with the resolution?
Yeah, I mean, it had a very, let's tie up all the loose ends, we'll kill him and blow things to bits. Just because, you can't, that's the other thing is you can't trust greedy people around Terminator technology. So,
and then of course we do get another Terminator coming in, and I read this guy's Latino. Am I mistaken in that?
Yeah, he does seem to have that vibe. This is Jackson Guice art, and it's very good.
Yeah.
You can see it's sort of Galassi-esque as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I actually think that there was some intentional invocation at some of these panels where he's like trying to make you see the connective tissue between that miniseries and this one. But also, let's be honest, Guice is a bit of a influence sponge anyway. But I don't mind it here. I think it looks really good. And I think this is probably around the time when he was at the peak of his powers. I like the moodiness of the story. I think that it works really well for Robinson. If anything, I think he's probably more of a compliment to Robinson's noir inclinations. And there's some great sequences in here where they're getting into Sloane going to a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist, as is prone to the Terminator series, not believing the things that Sloane is confessing to him. The conflict of, well, is this going to lead to a bad place? You've also got the B story of the serial killer that's going to play into the finale. Robinson could just be the guy who's wrapping up the loose ends and getting the hell out. I like that he goes ahead and takes the time to try to come up with his own story to tell over the course of this 3-issue miniseries.
Yeah, well, I'd never seen James Robinson phone anything in at this stage of his career. So he always put everything into it, no matter what it was. Whether it was a Vampirella issue or Grendel or Batman, he always put a lot into it.
Terminator Endgame #1 was September 1992's 41st ranked release per Diamond Comic Distributors, as reported by Wizard, the Guide to Comics #15, and was the first place Dark Horse title. Other multimedia comics out that month included Archie's Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa, Dark Horse's Classic Star Wars, Dark Horse International Star Wars Magazine, DC's Cool World movie adaptation, Malibu's Alien Nation, The Lost Episode, Marvel's 12th and final issue of Bill and Ted's excellent comic book by Evan Dorkin, Millennium's Doc Savage, The Manual of Bronze, and Mirage's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #50 and Special #1.
Solicitation copy from Dark Horse Comics Insider #10, covered in October 1992. The Terminator Endgame #2 of 3. By the way, this copy only takes up half the page for reasons that will be clear shortly. The half Terminator Dudley and Colonel Mary Randall are reunited finally as they resume their quest to save Sarah Connor and ensure the birth of her son John. But Dudley is having problems controlling his Terminator half, and Mary finds out the hard way. The penultimate chapter in Dark Horse's final Terminator series moves inexorably toward a climactic encounter with the new Terminator on the block. James Robinson, Jackson Guice, John Beatty, John Higgins. Monthly, shipping October 6, 1992. Excerpt from the inside front cover of Endgame #3, What Came Before. After finally tracking down the missing Dudley, Colonel Mary Randall has learned of the existence of a new Terminator on the scene, one hell-bent on presenting the birth of Sarah Connor's baby. Mary has contacted Sloane for assistance, and the pair set off for Odessa, Texas, where they expect to find Sarah. Not only is the new Terminator hot on their heels, but so is Catfish, the serial killer out to bring peace to the entire planet, and get Sloane in the process. Meanwhile, Dudley, whose Terminator half has regained control, has been terminated by his own hand.
Dudley's computer side had taken over when his human part was placed in a coma-like brain death, but the same state left the unit largely immobile and functionally useless. However, the arrival of the Endgame Terminator allowed it to remotely reach the Dudley unit, ordering it to contact and terminate Mary Randall. However, the human Dudley regained control in the tussle and warned Mary that John Connor was still being targeted. Mary gave Dudley a goodbye kiss, then he lit a stick of dynamite that was in his mouth, which would trigger the pile of explosives that he was sitting on. Meanwhile, Catfish caught up with Sloane's therapist and set him up to be blamed for the dude's murder.
And then we get into the second and third issues with those covers. I think that it's very clear that they're trying to invoke Sarah Connor, even though she's never explicitly shown in this books. Obviously, they don't want to have any likeness issues, so they obscure her face in the brief flashes in which she does appear. But they're trying to make Mary as Sarah Connor T2 as they possibly can with these things, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Things don't go well with the Dudley character. Did you have enough investment in that character from the previous miniseries for that to matter to you in this miniseries?
It just seemed like, oh, that's a pity. Yeah.
Guy.
Like, I didn't think there was the hint that he sort of wanted something romantic with the freedom fighter from the future. Can't remember her name. Mary. Yeah, that I wasn't invested in that working out. Like, it didn't really seem like a romantic movie where they were going to have a happy ever after anyway.
And then you got the bit too where the Catfish, the serial killer, gets a hold of the psychiatrist and not only tortures him to death to get information on Sloane, but also leaves him hanging upside down from a bunch of wires. And it occurs to me that this should have been around the same time as Spawn number 4, where they also hang up a person by a bunch of stuff and then leave him to die. Was there something in the 90s I missed that was a thing? Was there like a source point for this particular conceit?
I presume every serial killer is a frustrated visual artist who's trying to make an impact. The sort of people who work on David Fincher films of the era.
Terminator Endgame number 2 was October 1992's number 55 title per Diamond, as reported by Wizard number 16, third place for Dark Horse, behind Magnus vs. Predator number 1 and Star Wars Dark Empire number 6. The 67 seconds graphic novel from Epic Comics was out this month in softcover for $15.95, so Paul's details were a little off. It was cover featured on an edition of Comic Shop News, which is how Frank knew of it.
In that same Dark Horse Insider, with cover art of Dr. Giggles and back cover painted art of Predator vs. Magnus Robot Fighter, half the page for number 2, other half the page for the Terminator Endgame, number 3 of 3. The fight is on. Everything is coming to a head at Odessa Hospital on the day of John Connor's birth. Mary, Sloane, Catfish, and the Terminator battle over the future of mankind. Will Mary and Sloane be successful in changing history? Written by James Robinson, yada yada, Jackson Guice, John Beatty, John Higgins, shipping October 27th, 1992.
Mary, Sloane, Catfish, and the final Terminator all converged on the hospital in Odessa, Texas, where Sarah Connor was about to give birth. Cue lots of people getting gunned down or otherwise killed in the hallways. Mary briefly incapacitated the Terminator by electrocuting it in a pool of water, but it swiftly rises to slay more. We repeatedly cut to Sarah Connor in labor to escalate the tension. In a stairwell, Mary blew up an oxygen tank that took most of the T-800's flesh off. Whether deluded into thinking he really was a Terminator, or simply committing suicide by cop, Catfish raced towards Sloane and was shot dead. Then Sloane joined Mary on the rooftop for a final confrontation with the Terminator, but it vanished once Sarah Connor successfully gave birth. The future was altered. The rebels defeated Skynet hours earlier than before, so that no Terminators were ever sent backward in time. Everyone killed by Terminators in this past were revived, the only deaths left intact dealt by human hands, as when Sloane shot Catfish. The temporarily displaced human soldier and the police lieutenant couldn't recall why they were there, and Sarah Connor asked to see her son, only to be corrected, because she had given birth to a girl. Something happened today that changed the future. Something wonderful. And in that future, Jane Connor leads her troops to victory.
And then in the final issue, we've got the Terminator roaming around the hospital. Again, this is a situation where this is a natural, we've done the police station already. We don't want to go back to do that. So Robinson finds that twist where it's like, okay, now we're in a hospital, a much more sprawling complex. The Terminator has no way of knowing where Sarah Connor actually is because steps have been taken. She knows better. And it's funny because when you think about it, it really shows you how good Sarah Connor is at being mother to the future, given that not even the freedom fighters from the future that are looking forward to quote unquote help her can find her and get to her in time to help her and ultimately are not needed anyway.
Yeah. Once again, a total side quest to the main story. So,
and then if you like, now would probably be the time where it turns out that all these efforts have led to a bit of a twist.
Ooh. Yeah, I liked the twist because it was kind of like acknowledging that the movies are going to tell their own story, and let's leave them to it by telling our own story. Let's do the comic verse version of Terminator instead of the movie version. So, and that twist is that Sarah Connor gives birth to a daughter, Jonathina or whatever.
Joan. No, it's actually Jane Connor, but she still is going to lead the troops to victory against the robots. But one of the things they talk about is it's very Back to the Future to my mind, is incremental change. All these people have gone back in the past and fought these Terminators and defeated these Terminators, have also pushed up the time frame, and so it never gets as bad. We're never in the future that Mary came from because there are parts of the world that were not ravaged. Texas was apparently nuked to oblivion in the original future, and because of this change, now the Terminators are actually able to find what hospital Sarah Connor gave birth in because it's still standing and there's still records for it. They just can't tell what room she's in. So these changes are benefiting both the Cyborg, Skynet, and the Freedom Fighters, but ultimately favoring the Freedom Fighters because while the machine holocaust still comes, it's like a smaller holocaust. It's a littler holocaust, and people come out of it in a lot better shape. And to the point where the final Terminator that shows up in this miniseries never actually goes back through time and just vanishes, and nobody has to deal with him. Nobody has to defeat him because the efforts they've had have caught up with him, and he just vanishes.
Yeah. And I mean, that was interesting, but odd, I thought.
Well, it is funny because it gives you the opportunity for him to do his catfish story and give time to resolve the arcs of the various characters that have been introduced in these miniseries, but also it means that you can rush the finale and it's still fine because, bippity boop, time erased you and we don't have to worry about you anymore. We just have to explain what happened, and that's done in a few pages. So you don't have to devote so much time to explaining where we left. And in fact, the ambiguity allows you to decide if you want to do anything else with these characters or not, because you almost get a fresh start with them if you want to go back to them because their histories are not immutable.
Yeah. And it also does the thing of throughout this series, the Terminators are they're killing machines and that's all they are. But putting Catfish in the mix, it's very personal and he's vicious and he delights in the fact that the Terminators are going to kill everyone and wants to piggyback on that, like the ride on that chaos for a while, but it gives another person for James Robinson to put a lot of characterization into.
Yeah, you want to kill almost everybody? Can I help?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a nice little bonus in that story. It works to Robinson's strengths.
He gets a lot of mileage out of just 3 issues. It could have been very easy for this to feel shorted or rushed, but everything feels like it's paced deliberately. The action has space to breathe as well. I'm a little amazed that he managed to pull this off in 3 issues.
Yeah. I mean, he has the chops, doesn't he?
Terminator Endgame number 3 was October 1992's number 61 title, per Diamond, as reported by Wizard number 16. Between it and Endgame number 2 was Next Men number 8, leaving the Endgame finale in 5th place among Dark Horse titles. It was 11 slots ahead of Robocop, Prime Suspect number 1. Other multimedia comics out that month included the books I already listed when we covered Prime Suspect, so go listen to the 9th episode, The Enemy Within, if it means that much to you. The Terminal Cases letters columns in these issues were full of arguments about the continuity errors across the Dark Horse miniseries, an expression of regret that the Terminator license was now at another publisher, and a heated debate about gender pronouns and their intrusion into a pop culture property. Once again, their future is our past is their future.
In fact, I have a trade of Endgame, so I'm thinking of bringing it to Heroes Con to give to you if you want it.
If you want to get rid of it, I'll take it. If you need a big toothbrush or something in that space, then just let it.
Yeah, well, actually, it's a trade that they made from literally the issues, and it came out as a sort of previews thing.
Oh,
so
yeah,
I don't think it exists properly as a trade, but they've done a trade of it.
Interesting.
So it has card stock covers, and inside are the complete contents of all 3 issues, including ads and back pages and everything. Anyway, yeah.
The first trade paperback release of Endgame was an exclusive to Diamond Comic Distributors Star System, their reorder network. It was released in December of 1993, according to Mike's Amazing World, although the Grand Comics database more sensibly offers a 1992 date. The license was, after all, elsewhere by 1993. My understanding is that this was one of those cheapjack trades that just bundled unsold copies of the miniseries together under a new cardstock cover painted by John Bolton. A proper mass-market edition was released on January 27, 1999, with another new cover drawn by Ryan Benjamin. Solicitation copy from the Dark Horse website reads, "He said he'd be back. The The long out-of-print finale of the original Dark Horse Terminator run is finally available in one volume. In 1984, Sarah Connor is about to give birth to the savior-to-be of humankind's future. But in the 21st century, the monstrous supercomputer Skynet has one last chance to ensure its own future by sending its last man machine across time to terminate Sarah before John Connor can be born. With an unexpected ending that longtime Terminator fans will enjoy, Endgame features a taut, cinematic script by Eisner Award winner James Robinson, Starman, Leave It to Chance, and detailed, action-packed visuals by Jackson Guice and John Beatty. Endgame marks the end of the original Terminator era with a bang, lots of them. 80 pages for $9.95.
Overall, dug this one then?
Yeah, I enjoy this one. It seems really short, and it does a lot of, let's wrap everything up, which kind of hurts it, but also, I mean, it's nice to see endings for things, isn't it?
Yeah. And speaking of wrapping things up, what are your pages?
Yeah, I probably like page 4 of issue 3, which is the Latino-ish Terminator stepping out through the broken glass door in the hospital with 2 shotguns, and he's got glass embedded in him and stuff. That looks great.
Yeah, it really looks awesome, and he sells that musculature. He's not the same body type as Arnold Schwarzenegger, blessedly, but he's still got that fearsome quality, that unstoppable force element to him, and it's really nice, I think, with the perspective where he's got the one gun going in one direction, the other one in the opposing. He's not even looking at where he's aiming with the second rifle. The body language sells the Terminator.
And even little details like the glass door is completely gone, but the handle that went across the whole door is sort of bent there still.
The old school ashtrays, which obviously don't exist in hospitals anymore, but they still have them left over. There's even a no smoking sign, but they haven't bothered to take the things off the wall yet. So, and it's been an age since I've seen one of those type of ashtrays. So there's just nostalgia in that in and of itself. And what's funny too, that throws me off, because I don't know if they fully sell it, because I don't think they intended to sell it, but the thought that all this is happening between like 84, 85. So all the miniseries were period pieces. I didn't quite get that while they were happening, but something like that ashtray, okay, I could see that being around in 84, 85. So accidental period piece.
Yeah. My feeling about them as collector work, particularly, I mean, I never heard anything good about Now that I was like, I'm going to track those down, because it was all over, this sounds like a complete mess. And listening to your earlier episode has really confirmed that. But these are good. Like, they're good stories. It's a good little chunk of history about the Terminator, done really well in comics, and certainly a lot better than many of the movies, I would say.
Oh, truly, yes. It's like, speaking of the latter movies, or any of them to your mind worth watching?
I like the last one. I like Dark Fate because I like the action in it. It's got some good action, and the female Terminator, the good guy female Terminator, is really just cool. It's very cool. So, I mean, I'm sure if I did a podcast about it, I would have to tear it to pieces. But my impression of it was I really enjoyed that, and I have the 4K of it, so I can watch it whenever I want. I haven't got around to that again yet.
I saw 3 theatrically, and I liked it pretty well. I didn't mind that they'd reasserted that you may have stopped us now, but not in the future, and it's kind of recalls these Dark Horse comics. 4, though, turned me off to such a degree that I didn't bother watching any of the other ones, and I only finally watched Genesis once I started this podcast, mostly because I felt like that story was somewhat invalidated. Like, I just don't tend to count it. It doesn't seem like anybody else counts it either, and I wanted to be able to scavenge the music off of that and use it earlier than it would be queued up for, because they never did any adaptations for that one. I want to steal the score from that one. And I thought it was okay, but I could see where that could have been a viable path forward for them, but it's not the path I would have chosen. And certainly these actors could not portray the characters as well as the original actors. So it just felt like a weak stand-in. It felt like the TV version of the movies, and I wanted to stick with the movies.
Oh, it feels like a committee movie where the committee are mostly morons.
Yeah, definitely executives behind that one for sure.
Yeah.
Clearly, like, making choices as to what action figure they would get out of this movie, as a for instance.
I mean, what I really want from the Terminator films is to not do any revisionism or anything. Just do a really good action film. I would love to see, what's his face? George Miller. I'd love to see his Terminator film, because I think he would just do the action stuff and make it really, really visceral and exciting. Not worry about any timey-wimey, twisty...
Expletive. have deleted.
That everyone else seems to want to slip into these stories.
Well, and I think one of the problems too is that they keep going back to Sarah and John, and it feels like one of those franchises that just gets stuck in a position where you're not moving forward, kind of like where Star Wars and Star Trek got as well, where everything is stuck in this timeline. They just have to keep going back to Kirk, back to Spock, instead of progressing with it.
Yeah, well, everyone obviously feels like the biggest story with this franchise has been told already, so everything else is going to be lesser.
So, and I still haven't seen Dark Fate, so I'm saving that one because I count that one with Linda Hamilton, especially. I count that one, so I'm waiting to get to that one. And I've heard some good things. Like you said, I just think that the audience wasn't there for it anymore after all these false starts.
Well, Dark Fate has good action. That's how I recommend it.
And then as far as my pages, they're both from issue number 1. I really like the 4th page where Sloan kills the FBI guy, just because it's a silent page. It's cool. It's dark. A little bit of a Steranko vibe, especially in that first panel. Very Red Tide or Chandler. So I dug that. But given my druthers, I think I'm going to actually go with 14, which is the page where it's like, I don't know how many panels this is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. There's you're looking at a window, so the window itself is forming panels, even though it's just the panels of the window. And you've got cigarettes, and you've got statues, and you've got owl eyes, and there's just all this cool stuff going on as you've got the dialogue and the notes interspersed, and it's really cool how the page is constructed. It's just very thoughtful, very cinematic, but also, again, very literary. I just really dig it. Just a great piece of art that I'd love to own.
Yeah, it reminds me of, some of the Sandman stuff that was going on then, and also what Tony Harris was doing by that stage.
Oh, yeah.
And Mignola. There's Mignola touches.
Both those guys can construct a page like Mad Men. It's crazy.
Yeah. Alrighty.
I think we got that, Dan.
Marvel held the rights to produce Robocop until 1991, although technically their final issues had a January 1992 cover date. They released the only Robocop comics to that point, dating back to the 1987 movie adaptation, although they only really put out books in support of Robocop 2. Still, that was 2 years of monthly comics and half a decade of total activity. I tend to associate Robocop more with Dark Horse, probably because their slate better matched the violent and profane brand, but their run almost exclusively supported the release of Robocop 3. Things started out great with Robocop vs. the Terminator in May of 1992, but that dragged on an extra 2 months. The delay caused the Dark Horse Comics serial and the Robocop Prime Suspect miniseries to start before the event crossover had ended, and all of these projects were supposed to be backed by the release of a movie. Instead, the troubled Orion Pictures delayed the release until November of 1993, over a year later, so that the Robocop 3 movie adaptation that had finally begun in July had to sit on its final issue for over 2 months. It seems like Dark Horse more or less dumped their last story shortly thereafter and cut their losses.
Solicitation copy from the January 1994 cover dated Dark Horse Comics Insider number 25 with an X cover. Robocop Roulette number 104. This premiere issue is your ticket back to dystopian Detroit, where corpses keep popping up and where Robocop is the officer on the case. Robocop begins to follow the trail of murder and mayhem back to OCP, taking time out along the way to face off with an Ed 209 gone berserk and a man who could be the most pernicious villain of all, an IRS agent. Written by John Arcudi of The Mask, penciled by Mitch Byrd, inked by Brian Garvey of Aliens Newt's Tale, painted cover by Nelson of The U-Demon and Robocop 3. $2.50 US, $3.40 Canada, 32 color pages, painted cover, monthly, shipping December 7th, 1993. Mike's Amazing World of Comics disagrees. They say it came out on January 11th, 1994, per Previews Volume 3, number 11, supported by the Capital City Usenet.
A dude with an Abe Lincoln beard had been driving a luxury car 113 miles per hour for 20 minutes, trying to escape a largely unseen robot, before the car is blasted off the road and Abe is captured. Cut to a Detroit police precinct and to a cop that, I'm going to be reductive and just call blonde Harvey Bullock. He's fat, lazy, not very bright, surly, ungrateful, and a bit of a chauvinist and bigot. Throughout the miniseries, people give him vital information that he claims he would have found on his own, connects dots for him that he'd missed, have their good work undermined because of his need to be in charge of any given situation, and is your basic poster child for all cops being bastards. He has a slight arc in this story, and presumably would have been an ongoing supporting player, but we waste too much time on this pud as is if he's never going to show up again. When a John Doe is identified as a former OCP scientist, blonde Harvey Bullock thinks to talk with Dr. Marie Lazarus since she's in-house and had OCP ties. It's funny because Lazarus was played by Jill Hennessy in Robocop 3 as being fairly glamorous, or at least Hollywood normal, and a clear love interest for Alex Murphy. That was reflected in Dark Horse's adaptation, but the rest of their material casts Lazarus as a mousy, friendly, but overburdened advocate for Murphy. The artist favors that take, but being Mitch Byrd has to give her skirts several sizes too small, even if only the readers notice. Anyway, the quote, lady scientist didn't know the John Doe, but Robocop remembered him from the team that made him. However, Harvey Bullock is dismissive of that connection because he refuses to see Robocop as anything more than a machine, pointedly refusing any help from it. Almost halfway through the issue, so we need an action beat. Apparently, several Ed 209s have fallen into criminal use since the collapse of OCP, and Robocop has to shut one down in story. Again, probably setting up a subplot for a future miniseries, never to be. But at least we get to see Robocop turn a stop sign into a throwing star that carves down Ed's head till dead. Then the IRS guy from the Dark Horse Comics serial turns back up, which I'd forgotten all about, from a podcast released just 4 months ago, and he'd been out of print a lot longer. The IRS guy wants to test Robocop's fitness as a former OCP asset that the government has ongoing litigation to claim. And while Dr. Lazarus is resistant, she legally has to comply. I got the smarmy blonde IRS guy confused with the smarmy blonde FBI guy from Mortal Coils, having forgotten that dude died, but I do wonder what happened to Robocop's federal marshal status. But then again, Robocop 3 ended with Murphy and the local police taking part in a full insurrection, so what even is the basic continuity here? For the record, Roulette arrived over 2 months after the conclusion of the Robocop 3 adaptation, and nearly a year and a half since the introduction of the IRS subplot in Dark Horse Comics #1. Toward the end, blonde Harvey Bullock arrives hours late to the scene when the Abe Lincoln guy's corpse turns up in a junkyard. In an abrupt conclusion, we cut to George Crimmins in a prison cell. He's the black OCP scientist who helped Lazarus work on Robocop in the Prime Suspect miniseries, but ended up trying to frame Murphy after killing a guy himself. We get a big splash page look at the new robot as it breaks Crimmins out of stir. I have to admit that I've been spoiled by Xenopedia, who do a simply incredible job of archiving the Aliens vs. Predator universe. I choose to write my own synopses most of the time because I don't want to get as deep into the reads as they do, and there's admittedly some ESL issues in their writing, but there's always a link to at least a stub on any sub-references I might need to shortcut my own work. The Terminator wiki is solid enough, handy when I need a quick reference on key characters and developments in the comics. The Robocop wiki, by comparison, is nearly worthless. All they offer most of the time is the cover, credits, and solicitation copy. There is so much less material to cover than AVP or even Terminator, but clearly nowhere near the same passion to make that kind of effort on Robocop. That's a part of why I'm so dismissive here, because it's easier to just call some dude Abe Lincoln when I'd have to reread the comic to find individual and ultimately irrelevant data points. Cards on the table, I'm a big fan of Mitch Byrd, going back to his too short stint on Guy Gardner Warrior, so I'm more receptive to this series than the rest of Dark Horse's Robocop output. Rolled Spine podcasts have dragged the late John Paul Leon more than any other artist in our decade of producing shows, and I think Hong Nguyen was one of the worst artists any major publisher tried to put over with fans. I never heard of Nick Nazzo before reading Mortal Coils, and he had his moments, but Mitch Byrd was at the top of his game by this point. I covered Starship Troopers on last week's Dark Horse Presents Aliens, and Even with Arthur Adams involved, I was frustrated and a little offended that Byrd was extensively redrawn there. Purely by virtue of offering unmolested Byrd pencils, this was always going to be my favorite Robocop solo miniseries by default. The cover was credited to Nelson and Judah Tversky, featuring the modified Ed 209. According to Comicron's reporting of Diamond Comic Distributors' sales numbers for January 1994, it was the 214th ranked comic in units, 187th in dollars, selling 12.2%, as well as that month's Amazing Spider-Man comic in 22nd place. Dark Horse was the 5th ranked publisher with 4.99% of the market, trailing Marvel, DC, Image, and Malibu, but ahead of Valiant's 4.32%. Roulette #1 ranked 13th among Dark Horse titles, led by the debut of the X ongoing series, trailing the likes of Aliens Predator, Deadliest of the Species #4, Aliens, Music of the Spears #1 and Labyrinth #4, Predator Bad Blood #2, and the usual Star Wars, Sin City, Next Men, and Grendel stuff. Even the doomed Dark Horse Comics anthology from which Robocop sprang, and the zombie superhero universe of Comics' Greatest World with Out of the Vortex #4. But Roulette was 7 places above Thing from Another World, Eternal Vows #2, continuing stories from a box office bomb of 12 years prior. I thought I was simply missing an issue of Dark Horse Insider, even though my gaps are now few. But going back several issues, we slide right from Mortal Coils to Roulette in an unbroken streak. Insider just skipped from the 1st to the 3rd Roulette in issues number 25 and 26. Solicitation copy from the Dark Horse Comics website for Robocop, Roulette #2 of 4 reads, IRS agent Philo Droot begins efficiency tests on Robocop, but what are his true motives? Meanwhile, a robot abducts former OCP scientist Crimmins from his prison cell and takes him to a mysterious trio of hoodlums. When Robocop discovers that yet another scientist, Sick, is in grave danger, he assigns himself to the case. But instead of Sick, Robocop finds himself face to face with a mechanical adversary he hadn't counted on. Repeating a plot point from Prime Suspect, George Crimmins was a scientist who developed the Robocop project, but there were multiple siloed specialists needed for the final product. Another shadowy organization, possibly the same one from Prime Suspect, needs that knowledge for their own research. However, their relationship to Crimmins is different, as he's essentially a captive working for them under threat of death. So that's 2 secret cabals introduced by John Arcudi that will never be paid off. As with Prime Suspect, Crimmins only has a piece of the Robocop puzzle, so this cabal is kidnapping and killing all the other team members, one by one. The guy that they really need is Bradford Sick, your basic Albert Einstein-type central casting elderly scientist. Sick is the dude who figured out how to integrate the remains of Alex Murphy's brain into an at least partially autonomous cyborg. In the meantime, Crimmins will play within his own cybernetic expertise, help where he can, and repeatedly grovel for his life. Geez, this character had promise when he was introduced, but is a punchline now. Having made the connection to Bradford Sick, Robocop raced to his house to offer police protection, but instead was confronted by the new robot. It is identified as the Stealth Bot, about the same dimensions as an Ed 209, but vastly more swift and agile. It looks suspiciously similar to the Sentinels from the Matrix movies, with a central eye assortment flowing into multitudinous cable tendrils that look like silver dreads. The Stealth Bot absolutely wallops Robocop, leaving him eating grass on the lawn, but Sick had already evacuated. The Stealth Bot flew back to a mobile airship, which may or may not house the Cabal and their research center. It wasn't entirely clear, and I'm not going to worry about figuring out the finer details. The big reveal at the end is that the IRS guy is also working for the Cabal. Duh. The cover this month was by John Bolton, who was certainly a reliable presence among the company's violent action movie adaptations, but who thinks of him on a property like this? Sales plummeted to 18th place among Dark Horse titles, 230th overall in units, 221st in dollars, selling 6.4% of Amazing Spider-Man or 388. In its defense, This was one of those stunt issues with a dumb foil cover enhancement where they re-killed Peter Parker's parents. But also a minor gimmick, as these things went. Robocop was beaten by all the usual stuff, except John Byrne had debuted Danger Unlimited, and another Comics Greatest World series launched, Catalyst: Agents of Change. Adding to the pile-on was a new Indiana Jones miniseries, The Arms of Gold, and a concluding one, Thunder in the Orient. I think Indy was the free extra Lucasfilm threw in when you licensed Star Wars, so that's not a great look. Also outselling Robocop was the Chaos Comics knockoff Rack and Pain, The Shadow, and Bruce Zick's Atlas mini, which is at best the third thing Zick's known for in comics, to the degree he's known at all. Just to rub it in, the Paul Gulacy Thing miniseries and Age of Reptiles have come from behind to overtake Robocop. Comicron doesn't have numbers for most of the rest of 1994, and while I have some of the months they're missing, mine don't kick in until August. Also, its pages ripped out of Diamond Dialogue, and one of them slipped behind a heavy desk drawer with closed runners. I tried to fish it out with a self-sticking magazine bag, but lost that too. I finally got both out by wrapping a telescoping Swiffer handle with tape. The things I do for you people, even without sales figures, I'm pretty confident Robocop stocks were falling almost as fast as OCP's.
Solicitation copy from the February 1994 cover dated Dark Horse Comics Insider number 26, and a pattern made familiar by Terminator Endgame as it was burning off that franchise's catalog of material. Robocop Roulette 3 and 4 are both solicited on the same page of the same issue. Robocop Roulette number 3 of 4, Meet the Stealth Bot, the latest in high-tech weaponry and remote control destruction. Built with OCP technology, can the stealth bot pinpoint Robocop's Achilles heel and bring him to his knees? Or will Murphy's sharpshooting and sophisticated systems keep him on top of law and order in his search for the missing OCP scientist, Bradford Sick? Painted cover by Nelson, monthly shipping February 1st, 1994.
Not Harvey Bullock and other officers had joined Bradford Sick at an isolated cabin that he owned, mostly off the books. Robocop had asked that Sick be called while he made his way to the house where he confronted the stealth bot, but Harvey had taken that extra step of protective custody to claw back control of the case. Harvey tries to pump the scientist for information, but Sick recognized that the dude was more a liability than an asset and snuck out through the bathroom window. Then the stealth bot showed up and killed everyone but not Harvey Bullock, because George Crimmins wants to use him to build Robocop 4 or whatever. In the meantime, he'd created a rabbit Borg to show what he was capable of, but the brain chassis disconnect made the bunny leap to its death. Bradford Sick made his way back to town and placed a call to Robocop at the station. Speaking cryptically, the scientist was able to set up a meeting where Alex Murphy had been killed so that outside parties wouldn't be able to figure out the details. The IRS had been informed about the existence of the cabin, which put Robocop on the IRS agent's trail. Nelson and Judah Tversky returned for their third and final cover, which is the closest to an answer we'll ever get of why this thing was titled Roulette. By the way, I hated the Roulette logo, a series of black and red squares with white letters of different fonts, both too on the nose yet too obtuse, because why letter it like a ransom note? Also, this cover features a menacing cybernetic bunny rabbit, which is certainly distinctive, but not necessarily in a commercially viable way. The hair metal album airbrush styling of Nelson made this look more like an 80s Now Comics Terminator. Media adaptations out around the same time as this miniseries include Eclipse's Rawhead Rex collection, Harvey's Stone Protectors, Malibu's Black Sabbath, Lita Ford, the Queen of Heavy Metal, Ozzy Osbourne, Project AKO and World Domination, Marvel's Beavis and Butthead and Ren and Stimpy Show special Powdered Toast Man, Now's Married with Children 1994 annual, Nemesis Frank and Ultraman, and Topps Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, Exosquad, Jurassic Park, Raptors Attack, and Zorro. DC's Looney Tunes started in March, one of the longest lasting series still continuing to be produced, at number 280, as of this writing. Another sci-fi action comics adaptation that I won't be able to shoehorn into this podcast is Demolition Man, but I do love that flick. Oh, and even though it started as a comic, didn't Harris Comics' Harsh Realm get a very short run on Fox? Or was that just an unaired pilot?
Robocop Roulette number 404. The dice got tossed one last time in the concluding issue of this tale of chance and mischance. Crimmins, a prisoner in the Shadow Government's laboratory lair, gambles on a sudden show of heroics, while Detective Haas turns the tables on the man behind the killer stealth bot. But OCP robotics expert Bradford Schick is the one the villains really want. When he eludes them, they put all their money on a last-ditch, no-holds-barred campaign to bring in Robocop, dead or alive. Painted cover by John Bolton, Army of Darkness, shipping March 1st, 1994. According to Mike's Amazing World of Comics, that schedule shifted a little bit. They had Roulette number 1 on January 11th, Robocop Roulette number 2 on February the 8th, Robocop Roulette number 3 on March 1st, and number 4 on March 29th. So slipped about a month, or more likely it started a little bit later.
The IRS agent agrees to tell what little he knows, but only if he's nowhere near Robocop. You see, if the cabal he works for can't locate Bradford Sick, their only alternative is to capture and dissect Robocop so that George Crimmins can hopefully figure out how it works. At least, that's a recycled plot point from Mortal Coils, released so soon ahead of Roulette that it's more likely a coincidence than a swipe. Working with Bradford Sick, Team Robo determine a weak point in the stealth bot. While it is capable of basic functions, it has no AI decision-making, so it has to be redirected by a remote pilot whenever a mission variable presents itself. The stealth bot is lured to the precinct, then its connection to remote guidance is jammed, leaving it defenseless against Robocop's varied attacks. Further, Not Harvey Bullock had sorta kinda heroically overcome his doping, knocked out an armed but wimp Crimmins, and then used his gun to capture the remote pilot. Again, all that seemed to be intended to happen on a cargo plane, and the spatial dynamics for that are impossible. Even though Not Harvey Bullock has mostly been an incompetent slimeball who got a bunch of fellow cops killed, he gets a good job from Robocop, and seems set up to continue a hero's journey. Puke. It's also a little gross that the black male scientist had a heel turn, but now there's a white male scientist available to fill the Emil Hamilton role. Bradford Sick ends the story showing remorse for having used too much of Alex Murphy's brains, allowing him to feel revulsion over his cybernetic half-life, and hopes that same excess of humanity will allow Robocop to someday forgive him. As I said, I dig Mitch Byrd, but he was always deadline challenged. The Guy Gardner book was full of fill-ins and guest sequences, but Byrd still had to bail early in the face of the monthly grind. He couldn't quite finish Roulette either, as Jeff Butler completed the issue. Butler is either working off layouts or mimicking Byrd's style, so it's not too jarring, but the Butler pages are tighter and more Bronze Age conventional. Inker Brian Garvey might have contributed to that consistency, but the blacks are heavier on the Butler pages. I like this earlier John Arcudi material, okay, but I think working on the Mignola BPRD material unlocked his weirder side that I enjoyed more. This last cover was again by John Bolton, with a too puny Robocop against a monstrous robot. The surreal qualities and excessively dark tones making this look like a horror comic instead of the broad, bright action inside. Presumably, the rights to Robocop might have been tied up in Orion's bankruptcy, but it doesn't seem to have been all that desirable a property, because the license lay moribund for nearly a decade. Even with the shenanigans of the rights to Terminator and Terminator 2, Judgment Day being offered separately and to different publishers, Dark Horse still reclaimed that license pretty much right after Marvel was done with it. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry to snag Robocop, and its next comics publisher would simply not be in the same class as Marvel or Dark Horse. But that's a story for a future time. Since Dark Horse has ceased to present Robocop, foregoing even a collection for half of their miniseries, we'll have to look backward for more Robo content in the immediate time frame.
New targets acquired.
Alex O., Andrew R., Benjamin Kellogg, Between the Pages blog,
Billy Hines,
who added, "Always a good time. I'm here a little for this one too. That left-hand page of Robocop holding the Terminator skull. Love it.
C.H. Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon,
Claes Fijdl,
The Comic Crash, Dave's Comic Heroes plug. Dead End Kid wrote,
I have been looking forward to this little saga. Thank you, boys. Checking the dates careful as ever, Frank. You're the Terminator comics journalism deserves. Y'all truly are machines. I passed up on a 1-to-4 bag set at a nice shop 6 months ago. Still kicking myself. Del Dracula, who also offered. I pulled the first 2 issues of this out of quarter bins in the 90s, but I'm sure I've never even seen issues 3 and 4 anywhere, not to mention the elusive trade paperback. So I appreciated the summary.
Derek WC, Dirk Ashton, Ed Moore at Teal Productions, Fanholes Podcast, Gavin Rizza, hashtag True Believer, Yes, Hal Kolbeck, History of Comics and Film,
Into the Weird,
Illegal Machine, The Irredeemable Shag,
Jared Keene, Jason,
Julia Rowell,
who tweeted, I remember the video game and I've read a little bit of the comic, but it's something I really wish was a movie or a game now in 2024. I'm currently playing Robocop Rogue City. Kamar Staples,
Keith G. Baker,
Kevin Stauier, Kreshimir Svuneric,
Lamar the Revenger,
Lily Matthews, Leah Ellison, Michaela June,
Maxo,
Michael Wagner,
Myers Sr.,
Neil Sanderson, Osaka Nipeu, Pete Flower,
Pine Time,
Relatively Geeky Podcast Network,
Richard Field,
Robot 17, Sean N., Corey,
Siskoid, Stop, Let's Team Up, Superbound,
Dead 2,
Thirsties, New and Used,
Trash Fiction Championship, Truck Artist,
and Twins Are Rising.
A lot of people who fell off came back for the crossover episode, so thanks for that. Even if we probably won't see that kind of response again. But we have picked up a couple of new YouTube subscribers, and past episodes have gotten some views since we began offering that avenue. So who knows? Frank wishes that he'd had the foresight to run Terminator Now as seasons, instead of continuous numbering. After a break in January, the show will shift to a bi-monthly schedule, alternating with Dark Horse Presence Aliens. Next year will be centered on comics related to the first Terminator sequel, as well as the second run of Dark Horse comics, and will end with 2 big crossover events in the year 2025. In the month of February,
Marvel Comics presents Robocop and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. You have been listening to Terminator Now, a Rolled Spine podcast. It is in no way associated with Himdale Film Corporation, James Cameron, not even Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm just the best impersonator Frank could find, but I'm pretty good, right? No infringement of rights are intended, and it's all covered by fair use. Anyway, nobody's making any money on this thing, and hardly anyone is listening, so don't waste your lawyer's time.